why does this happen? Why do I keep falling in love with this beautiful, charming, interesting, confident, sexy man? Beautiful, charming, sensual, interesting woman, and it feels so good, and the chemistry is off the charts, and why do they always end up hurting me, and why do I always end up not being able to protect myself? Well, that is answered in completion with the human magnet syndrome. Because I know this is a fact. You can't solve a problem if you don't know what it is. Before the human magnet syndrome was written, there was all of these different explanations on codependency. Most of them were because it was like personality weaknesses, personality traits, addictions. We now have an explanation, and I believe the fact that the book has sold 90,000 copies and it's now in 7 languages. I just found out it's in Russian, Korean. We got the Chinese publishers looking at it. It applies universally. It gives people the answer. But one of my favorite sayings is by Abraham Maslow, which formerly was everything's attributed to Mark Twain and Albert Einstein. They didn't say any of these things. Abraham Maslow said, if you have a hammer, you tend to see everything as a nail. If you are a typical good psychotherapist, you're going to see it from the vantage point of what you know. You will not be able to see something which you don't know. It literally will be invisible. And that is scary. If you're a psychotherapist, you won't recognize it. It's like it won't exist. And so I remember, I'm always doing things at the last minute, and I had this idea of this video clip I remember watching in the movie, What the Bleep Do We Know? Who here has seen that movie, What the Bleep Do We Know? It was really big in the 80s, but it's a great movie about spiritual and what's that term? Not existential, spiritual, parapsychological, spiritual, and the word that's escaping me, phenomenon. It's a really good movie to watch, and I would recommend it. But I'm going to play a clip that is, whether this is true story or not, it's metaphorical to what I've just been mentioning.
We match patterns that already exist within ourselves through conditioning. So a wonderful story that I believe is true is that when the Indians, the Native American Indians on the Caribbean islands, saw Columbus's ships approaching, they couldn't see them at all because it was so unlike anything they had ever seen before. They couldn't see it.
When Columbus's armada landed in the Caribbean, none of the natives were able to see the ships, even though they existed on the horizon. The reason that they never saw the ships was because they had no knowledge in their brains or no experience that clipper ships existed. So the shaman starts to notice that there's ripples out in the ocean, but he sees no ship, but he starts to wonder what's causing the effect. So every day he goes out and looks and looks and looks, and after a period of time, he's able to see the ships. And once he sees the ships, he tells everybody else that ships exist out there because everybody trusted and believed in him. They saw them also.
And the idea or the myth, whether it's true or not, is powerfully evocative. If there's something you'd never seen before, you don't recognize, you don't have words for, you don't have personal experience with, you won't see it. And in a sense, it will be invisible. And in the case of these Native Americans, or I don't know if they were American, they weren't Americans, but these indigenous people, they could not make sense of what these ships were. And of course, they brought in the expert, the shaman, and he studied it, and he started to say, I think there's some form of ships. And because he was respected and admired, everyone else started to see the ships also. So the point of that, I believe, myth, but certainly metaphorical story, is that with the human magnet syndrome and the codependency cure, and now the self-love recovery and the 10 stages, and my pyramids, which we're going to be talking about today, you will be able to see things that were invisible. I can tell you, as I can speak for my clients, and I've been working as a therapist for almost 32 years, that once you learn this stuff, you can't unsee it. And I'm not ashamed of it, but a little bit embarrassed, but I will tell you just a tiny bit. I have been doing some dating since my divorce, and I have not listened to the good advice of many, and I should have, but that's another story because I tend to learn, I make my own mistakes and learn from them. But in several instances when I was dating, I started to see things that were red flags. And as soon as I saw them, I got out of it. And that's the beauty of the human magnet syndrome and the self-love recovery treatment. As you move forward in the stages, you start to recognize things about yourself that you never knew existed. You start to recognize things about other people that you didn't know exist. And you understand the relational dynamics. And because the program goes from self-love deficit to self-love abundance, you start to build internal boundaries. It's so important to have accurate definitions, accurate explanations. When I first wrote the human magnet syndrome, I can actually remember when I was doing a chapter, and if you look at the first book, I have a whole chapter on codependency, and 2/3 of that chapter is what everyone else says. There is no reason why I should write 20 pages of what codependency is. Because if I had to write what is major depression, what is generalized anxiety disorder, what is schizophrenia, it might be, and if I wrote it well, it might be 2 or 3 pages. But there was so much information out there on what everyone thought codependency was. And it comes from so many sources, and they all were well-meaning because they all tried to understand something that they had no experience with. So in the human magnet syndrome, I wrote a definition of codependency, and you should remember it. And of course, it's on your handout, so there's no test. But it is simplistic, and it is profoundly accurate. It takes away all of the complications of all the different potential explanations of codependency. And I'm going to do this by heart, so it might be different from what's on the screen. A person who is in a relationship, mainly a romantic relationship, but all relationships, they give the preponderance of love, respect, and care to others. They expect it to be reciprocated, mutual. It's not, because we know SLDs, they fall in love with pathological narcissists, and of course, so they expected the LRC, love, respect, and care, to be reciprocated. It's not. They try to control or change it. They can't, and they stay in the relationship. That's it. That's your definition of codependency. It's a problem with the distribution of LRC in relationships. And then I go on and I talk about, and I do this in my second book, not in my first book, that you cannot confuse personality, mental illness, alcohol abuse. All of these variables are separate from codependency. There's honest codependence, there's lying codependence, there's alcoholic codependence, there's angry codependence. Codependency is a person in a relationship who gives all the LRC, expects it to be returned, and it's not. They try to equalize it, and they stay. I don't like the word codependency. It comes from the 1950s movement of understanding that alcoholism is not just an individual event. So by the time in the 1960s, they started to treat partners. And by the time in the 1970s, it became a standard part of alcohol treatment, that if you don't treat the partner of an alcoholic, the person's going to go home and relapse because they realize the partner keeps the system going. So they called the partner of the alcoholic the co-alcoholic and the co-addict. And they realized that person has problems too, and there is a connection. In the 1980s, they changed the term. They no longer wanted alcohol treatment facilities and drug treatment facilities to be separate because it made no sense, because they both were drugs. So they created the term chemical dependency. And so instead of co-alcoholic, it became co-chemically dependent. Well, that's just too many words and syllables. So co-chemically dependent became codependent. And so the term codependent started off as an explanation of the partner of the addict. And from there, it lost its meaning and became so many different things. But I say codependency no more. People who say you're codependent, it's a derogatory, it's stigma-inducing statement. It means something is wrong with you. You're codependent. Stop being codependent. What does that mean? It just means you're doing something that's annoying me, and maybe it's like, it doesn't really have a lot of shape. So I needed to get rid of the term, and so I came up with the terms self-love deficit disorder is the new term for codependency. The name of the problem is in the name of the person. Every codependent has a deficiency in self-love. So SLDD is the problem. The person is self-love deficient. That's the SLD. So if you follow me, one second. If you follow me, and I've been so focused on changing the world and trying to get rid of this word of codependent, you'll know that almost everything that I ever write, I will say SLD, SLDD, and because of the new people, I always put in parentheses codependency. And so then there was this point, I was so proud of it, but as soon as I wrote SLD out there, SLDD, I received thousands of responses of going, thank you. It makes sense. It feels right. It tells me that this is the problem. I understand how diagnoses work, but sometimes people have a mental condition, and when they no longer have it anymore, then why should they carry a diagnosis? It should not follow them. So I didn't like the idea of I'm a recovering codependent, because if you're an alcoholic, I'm a recovering nicotine addict. I haven't smoked in 13 years, and if I have one cigarette, everything goes south. I didn't want that idea for codependence, recovering SLD, because my experience was, as I talked about yesterday in my trauma stage 7 work, is people actually change, and they change irreversibly, and they never go back. Once they hit self-love abundance, you can't go back to being SLDD. So I wanted to create a term that explained self-love abundance. That explained the cure. So that was self-love abundant, SLA, and self-love abundance. So I introduced that to you is that these are not just terms that I wanted to create so I can be unique. It was my intention to come up with terms that made people feel good about themselves, not the fact that, yay, I have SLDD, hooray. No, this is true, it represents how I feel, and I want to get to the other side, which is self-love abundance. And then that's where I came up with the title, The Codependency Cure, which, by the way, since I came up with it, 3 other people have written books with the same title, and I've learned from an attorney, you can't copyright titles, so congratulations to them. But because you can't go backwards, the cure is permanent. A pyramid that represents the problem, and because of my personality and clinical background, I wanted to create an explanation of the problem is not the same as what are symptoms. And because everyone who goes to codependency therapy, the therapist not only doesn't know what it is, but they keep working on the symptoms. You know, why do I keep letting everyone walk on me? Maybe I should just set boundaries. But it doesn't work, it doesn't stick. And because it doesn't work, the treatment doesn't work, the therapy doesn't work, the person ends up feeling worse. So I wanted to create an explanation of the problem, and it's SLDD at the very foundation is caused by attachment trauma, which is the trauma experienced in your childhood and your formative years being raised by narcissists and codependent. Conditional childhood attachment, neglect, abuse, and deprivation. From attachment trauma comes core shame. It's this feeling of being fundamentally broken, fundamentally not good enough. It is what every SLD walks around with. Even with all of their accomplishments, and many of you who identify with being SLDD can be incredibly accomplished, but you can't outrun your accomplishments if you have attachment trauma and core shame. Because the attachment trauma cannot be resolved because it's unconscious, and that is why my Hitch method, which is on a training that I presented yesterday, is so crucial. From core shame comes this feeling of pathological loneliness, this bone-aching existential void. When I created that term, everyone said, oh my gosh, that explains it. It is this burning feeling that, remember, comes from core shame of that I don't feel connected in the world or myself. And the only time this goes away is when I'm in a relationship. And so then I came to understand that pathological loneliness, which is, by the way, the conscious experience of the attachment trauma that you can't remember because it's disassociated, I came up with the next level, which is an addiction. SLDD is an addiction. Oh my gosh, it's an addiction. If you don't believe me and you're an SLD, I say walk away from your partner who's abusive or gaslighting and pay attention to how you feel. And you will all talk about this burning feeling of the pathological loneliness. It is the withdrawal symptom. It is the primary withdrawal symptom that only goes away when you're in a relationship. The addiction is not the narcissist. It's the addiction to being in a relationship. But because of the human magnet syndrome, you're always going to pick the narcissist. And that addiction is one of the primary reasons that codependency treatment so often fails. And then from the addiction is the actual problem. That's where everyone comes to therapy for, SLDD. So the solution is the exact opposite is once you go through the 10-stage self-love recovery treatment program, you resolve attachment trauma. Everything kind of connects to the other. Once you resolve attachment trauma, then the core shame becomes core self-love or self-love abundance. From self-love abundance, this pathological loneliness comes from existential peace. And by the way, I get a lot of ideas from my clients. Sometimes they say the most brilliant thing. And one of my clients explained, you know, Ross, the opposite of pathological loneliness is existential peace. And she explained it, and I said, wow, can I use that? She was, sure, no problem. But it is comfort in your own skin, no void to fill, freedom to be happy, independent of relationship. And then I had to think, how do I make SLDD addiction the opposite? SLDD addiction is the pursuit of a relationship in order to take the pain away. So the opposite of that is needing mutuality in relationships. And self-love, self-respect, and self-care that engenders the same from others. And then at the top of the pyramid is self-love abundance. And those pyramids fundamentally explain everything I do in a simplistic way. And they inform the 10-stage self-love recovery treatment program.